Museum and Heritage Show. PLB are one of the museum's, one of the show sponsors, and are curating the talks for the design and interpretation. If I can introduce Dr. Amy Frost, as Senior Curator at Bath Preservation Trust, and myself, I'm Jamie McCall, the Creative Director at PLB, and the talk is about the old versus the new at No.1 Royal Crescent in Bath. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm going to talk for a bit and then I'm going to hand over to Jamie. I'm the Senior Curator at Bath Preservation Trust. We have 4 museums, and this afternoon I'm talking to you about No.1 Royal Crescent in particular and the work that we've done there. And I thought it would be good to set the scene as to what that museum was like pre-pandemic. So our kind of USB in the Georgian World Heritage City of Bath was that we are the only dressed Georgian historic house museum that's publicly accessible within the city. So we're the museum to go to if you want to sort of step over that threshold and see what actual life was like within those houses. We are run and owned by Bath Preservation Trust, which has 4 museums in the city, but also is the planning and architectural advocacy and campaigning body for Bath. So we review planning applications, we consult with developers, so we do quite a lot in the city. And for No.1 Royal Crescent, our business model is 100% reliant on admissions, grants and donations for our income. So we're a completely independent charity. Pre-pandemic, our public activity was annual changing exhibitions in a separate gallery space, public events programs, participation in city festivals, quite a lot of involvement with Bath as a World Heritage Site and World Heritage Site activity, and various programs. But the house itself was very static. The house did not change much, with the exception of being dressed for Christmas. The wider portfolio is that we also have the Herschel Museum of Astronomy, which is the house that the planet Uranus was discovered from. We have Beckford's Tower in museum, and we have the Museum of Bath Architecture. And we also do a lot of partnership work, so we are very involved with the Bath Museums Partnership, which is the 13 museums within Bath, and we do shared programming, shared marketing, and shared opportunities. So our interpretation at No.1 Royal Crescent pre-COVID-19 was very heavily reliant on room guides to deliver the majority of our interpretation. And coupled with that was quite a heavy focus on written material. So printed laminated sheets, the inevitable room book in every room that would have more information in it. And we recognized, even kind of, pre-COVID, that there were strengths and there were weaknesses with that setup. So the strengths were that it appealed to the traditional historic house museum visitor, that it was an accepted and trusted approach, particularly for the sort of National Trust visitor, and the strength was that the visitor income in the house was actually covering costs of not just the activity of No.1 Royal Crescent, but also some of the other museums, not all of them, but some of the other museums, and all of our advocacy and campaigning work. So this was the museum that generates the majority of our income. The weaknesses were that for some visitors, it was not an enjoyable experience. We didn't see much diversity in our visitors, particularly in terms of ethnicity, in terms of age profile. And increasingly resourcing this model of operation was becoming, in terms of volunteers needed, the staff capacity to manage those volunteers, and the cost of the volunteer activity, was becoming a real significant problem for us, as I'm sure it is for many people. Prior to the pandemic, we were regularly closing rooms, closing off parts of the museum, or having rooms with no volunteer guide in them, therefore no primary tool of interpretation. And that was an issue that was getting worse and worse and worse. And then for me, as curator in particular, we had absolutely no control over the narrative. So we did not know, and we, heavy volunteer training programs, but we didn't know what our volunteers were saying to the visitors. And that was becoming increasingly difficult. And, for example, their anecdotes could be comical, they could be harmless, they could be part of the charm that really appeals to a lot of visitors and gives that visitor experience a real personal touch. But we were also emailed by a visitor to say that they had been told by a room guide, in a volunteer room guide in one of the rooms, that, of course, Bath had absolutely no connection to the transatlantic slave trade. So the visitor experience was really inconsistent. The impact of the pandemic, as I'm sure it was for most of us here today, was disastrous. So museum closure led to losing 90% of our income overnight. We had enough funds in the bank for 3 months of salary payments. And we furloughed. We operated, the minute furlough was introduced, we operated on a vastly reduced staff team. So pretty much just the executive team. So there were 5 of us out of 36 of us who were working. Planning activity carried on and had to carry on. In fact, planning applications by the middle of 2020 increased. People saw it as an optimum time to submit planning applications to listed buildings. So our conservation team work just got higher and higher and higher, but it all moved online and it all moved from home. So we did what I'm sure a lot of you did. We developed online contents, we did at-home activities, things to support learning from home, teaching from home, lots of kind of online quizzes and social media, which was a brilliant period of creativity, but very, very resource heavy when you have a much reduced team. And we did lots of stuff in the community. We provided activity packs for our local food bank. We got together all the museums in the city and donated all of our gloves and PPE to the local hospital. And we started to generate new income. And unfortunately, at the end of summer 2020, we underwent a significant restructure, which was unfortunately inevitable. So what that meant was a really heartbreaking loss of some really, really good colleagues. So the impact of the pandemic on No.1 Royal Crescent, we did a volunteer survey with our existing volunteers, asking who might be willing to come back for that moment in the summer of 2020 when we knew we might be able to reopen. From 160 volunteers, fewer than 30 said that they would be willing to come back. And that made our operating model impossible. We couldn't open because we didn't have enough people. We also couldn't have a volunteer in half of the rooms and visitors with social distancing restrictions. So all of these things kind of combined together, which drove a need for real significant change. And we took the incredibly difficult and very brave decision to permanently remove room guides from the museum. So to completely change what had been the existing interpretation model ever since the house had reopened in the 1970s. So we needed to seek a viable model for operating. We had a lot of early grant success, so we secured the NLHF emergency grant, which enabled us to cover core costs for reopening, such as PPE, signage, conservation materials, interpretation. We also factored into that emergency grant installing a new CCTV system, because there were lots of collections care implications by removing the physical person from every room. And also invest in a new content collections management system, which amazingly we didn't have pre-pandemic. So it gave us a kind of new business model, and the trustees of the organisation approved a new business plan. And then the Cultural Recovery Fund was launched. And we went into opening of summer 2020, and here is me uncovering a picture for reopening in summer 2020. With minimal interpretation, we had one text panel in every room, and that was it. And very, very limited visitors, so a family group or support bubble of up to 6 people every 10 minutes. And this period enabled us to become familiar with COVID guidelines, with health and safety, and helped us also understand what a post-pandemic visitor was looking for. And by the end of the year, alongside my colleague Claire Dixon, our Director of Museums, we wrote a new interpretation strategy to move forward and look at a new viable opening model. Don't expect you to read this, but essentially our interpretation strategy was a really, really significant document for us. It informed our tender brief for the project. It detailed all aspects, including historical content, drivers for change, local context, current interpretation, and a SWOT analysis of the existing museum. But importantly, it also included new interpretive themes and threads, current and target audiences, and implications for interpretation needs and requirements, as well as techniques, design principles. It was a very significant document, and we wrote it really quickly. So this proved to be a really significant undertaking, and it was a very high quality document. What we lacked during the entire process was exactly the thing that we all know you should all be doing at the beginning of a process like this, and that was consultation. We were right in the middle of lockdown. We did no public consultation whatsoever. So our mantra from the very beginning was that we will evaluate the hell out of it. And what we put, therefore, at the heart of the strategy was a real commitment to change and a commitment to ongoing change. So really seeing this idea of no interpretation being permanent. This was the start of a change for us to ensure that we were continually evolving and developing the stories we were telling and the means through which we were telling them. And always evaluating the hell out of it. So we then got to commissioning the consultants, and this was a new experience for me. So at this time, I'd been working for the organisation for 18 years, and I had never, at this level, commissioned a project like this. So we learned a lot internally, as well as the work that we did. So the interpretation strategy was the fundamental part of our brief, and it outlined all of the interpretation needs and our ongoing commitment to public access. But we were seeking external support to create and install a new experience that would prove to be both contemporary, exciting, very importantly accessible, but really, really importantly from the very beginning, sustainable and flexible. What we wanted was infrastructure so that we could then change more frequently. We could ensure that that investment in infrastructure meant that we could bring in new stories. We could change the ways that we were doing things. So we prioritized layering interpretation and the need to be able to build on it and change continually in order to ensure repeat visitors. And this was also a response to the pandemic. Bath, as a destination, was getting millions of international tourists every year who just disappeared overnight. And that meant that actually the local and the hyperlocal and the repeat visitor became our primary audience, certainly in the middle of the pandemic. And we hoped that that would help us establish a model where we could continue to build on that local and repeat visits as we recovered. And we're currently not looking at recovery until 2024, so full recovery till 2024. So we advertised the opportunity to recruit across museum, heritage, interpretation platforms, and we also personally invited some specific heritage consultants to apply. We shortlisted from the applications, and myself and our Director of Museums, along with one of our trustees, Julie Finch, who's currently the CEO of Compton Verney and soon to be the CEO of the Hay Festival, and she chairs our Museums and Education Committee. We interviewed 4 firms in just before Christmas 2020, so the 18th of December, I remember this, 2020, and finally selected PLB to be our consultants. So the maximum budget, including VAT, was initially £300,000. And this was to include all fees, all infrastructure, all equipment, and any other costs relating to development. It's important to convey at this point that in the historic rooms, so there are 10 historic rooms within the house, we had one plug socket in each room. Which made hoovering a nightmare. And we had no Wi-Fi, and we also had no capacity to enable Wi-Fi within the historic house. So I should say it's a Grade 1 listed house built in 1767. So by the end of the project, we were able to kind of redeploy some budget from another part of the grant, so that we were then looking at 430,000 for 3 different experiences, which Jamie's going to talk to you about. Georgians at Home in Bath, Jane Austen in Bath, and a Georgian Christmas. The timeline was agreed to enable us to start work in January 2021. So that's everything, developing the content, everything. To be open in time for Easter 2021. And as you know, in 2021, the date was then announced for the 17th of May for museums and attractions to reopen. And we made the conscious decision to actually delay our opening, so to not go for the 17th of May, which actually, as it turned out, was quite a good thing. But to make sure that we'd been running the AV, we trained all our staff, and we were ready to open. So we opened on the 2nd of June 2021. So we started the project on the 2nd of January and we opened on the 2nd of June. I'll talk a bit about the outcomes later, but I'm now going to hand over to Jamie to actually go through what we developed and what we installed.
Thanks, Amy. So obviously we were really, really lucky to be appointed for this prestigious project, but really, really unlucky that we had only a few months to deliver it in, a lot to do, and no way of travelling anywhere in the country to do it. A little bit about PLB. So we're a specialist heritage consultancy based in York. We've been going for 30 years. We pride ourselves on delivering key experiences that really make a difference. We want to bring visions to life, and we feel that we not only look at the big picture, but we also can focus on those little things that really make a difference, that help capture the imagination and bring an emotional connection for the stories that are being told. But to do this, we realised we had to bring a full team together. So we went out, we found people with the right experience, specialist consultants, those with storytelling skills, family skills, those that knew the sort of subjects. But, which one are we on? But what we needed to do is look at delivering this new cutting edge, new visitor experience that would take No.1 out of COVID and go forwards. As I mentioned, we had special consultants working with us along with contractors. We selected New Angle Production and DJ Woolrich to be our media partners because we realised that was going to be really big. And we'd worked with them previously, so they understood how we were going to operate and we knew what they could bring. We also looked at this key milestones in this program, which was very, very short for us to deliver. And we had to look at those areas that we need to expedite and those areas that were potential risks. So obviously getting the approvals for any changes to the house had a large risk for that, for the application, for the conservation. But sorting that, we moved forwards. As I said, we weren't able to go anywhere or see anything, so we had to draw on experience that we've done before. So we worked on Charles Dickens Museum, and that was looking at bringing him to life. So similar to what we wanted to put forward for No.1 Royal Crescent was actually creating someone that someone could connect to that moved through the house. The museum that many of you might know in Doughty Street is the only one of his homes, London homes, left, and it actually tells the story of his married and family life when he got there and how that influenced his writing. And on that project we were able to work with both New Angle and DJ Woolrich to deliver that within the historic house setting, so we knew they had an empathy for what we wanted to do there. And when it opened, it had in excess of 10,000 visitors in its first month. So we knew that there was a potential take for that kind of work. We also just completed a project pre-pandemic for Bletchley Park. And Bletchley Park's very much focused on what happened within the site itself, looking at all of the code breaking. But what we were asked to do was to bring in this emotional connection of the people that work there to help tell that story. And on this one, we had a 23-meter long screen, told the story of D-Day and how that went from the micro of the site itself up to the macro in Europe and those that were happening. We incorporated archive footage, images, documents, all of those things to help to build that story. Again, another good example that we could take into the house to have a look at how we might be able to bring that story to life at No.1. And the last one, which is quite an interesting one, we did up in Scotland, which is at Moat Bray. So it reopened as Scotland's first national centre for children's literature and storytelling. And it's basically focused around Barry and him writing of Peter Pan. So we were able to draw in those elements through this historic house to tell a narrative that you begin to discover more and more about what made that happen. Things like you discover Tinkerbell's bell, there's interactives, you can try and catch a fairy character, you interact with Peter Pan, and you go to see the Darlings Nursery and Nana's Kennel you can crawl through. So all these sorts of elements that really help to bring those sorts of schemes in this historic house to life. So what was our design considerations for No.1? So importantly, we needed to look at the visitor route. We'd worked quite hard on, this is one for Charles Dickens, about how to move people up and down the house with minimising the crossover. Again, something that was going to become quite important through COVID. And we worked to design day capacities. We also needed to look at a turnaround time. So how can they change the house for special events? How long does it take to change anything? And how could we have hidden gems in the house in plain sight of the visitor without them realising? We knew we wanted to incorporate soundscapes, bringing each room to life, and also to be based on the actual residents that lived there. However, No.1 wasn't great for that because it had a merchant that lived there who didn't really do much with the house. So we had a starting point of having to create a family from the very offset. But we felt they could help bring in seasonal change. So the soundscapes, we could have things like carols at Christmas and people preparing for different elements in the year. We wanted this idea of bringing in any interpretation into printed sort of facsimiles, so how we might use what was in the house to overlay it with interpretation, but quite subtly, tablecloths, the actual cooking pots, those sorts of things themselves, and how elements of surprise could bring things to life. So talking mirrors, talking portraits, those sorts of things. We also wanted to keep it very broad, so we were quite keen that we were able to transform the house at different times and that we were able to bring in different trails that appealed to different audiences. So that was always in the offset. So anything we put in had to be quite multifunctional, and that went to the heart of the AV and especially the hardware, which, as Amy rightly pointed out, there was nothing in the house, no plug sockets, no cabling, no nothing for us to use. So we had to start from a very early point to make sure that we got that right. But most importantly is the message. So the message, the overarching message of the house was life as it was lived in Georgian Bath in the 1770s and 80s. So this was a lifestyle that wasn't as it seemed. It was very superficially presented. So it appears quite glamorous, but there was lots of underlying themes in terms of exploitation of the poor, women and the lack of power that they had, Bath as a commodity market for marriages, those kind of controls and fortunes being won and lost very quickly in that period. We wanted that all to come out through the narrative of the story as you went round the house. And we set on the visitor experiencing a day in the life at No.1 from morning to night. So visitors were taken back to Thursday, October the 14th, 1779, where you actually go in and you meet the family who have come to Bath to start the season. You begin to learn about their leisure pursuits, visiting coffee houses, lending libraries, card games. We didn't want to just keep it inside No.1. We also had the amazing Bridgerton that had come out at the Christmas, which had actually was filmed at No.1. No.1 is their family home, although a little more animated in the programme itself. But it also began to give an interest in the life in the Georgian period of the time. And so we had a family, we set a family, we created a father, Thomas, who was 54, a mother, Amelia, his wife, who was 41. They had an eldest daughter, Charlotte, who was there for the season, obviously looking for a partner. Alice, the younger daughter, who's 17, really not interested in that at that time. Richard, the eldest son, and then we introduced 2 other sons, so Edward, who was not there, who was away at war, and Harry, the youngest son, that wouldn't have been taken to Bath at the time. We also then introduced some of the servants and staff in the house, so we have Mrs. Knott, the housekeeper, who's 41, Joe, the footman, 18, Barnes, the lady's maid, 22, Jane, the scullery maid, 13, Mrs. Andrews, the cook, was 43, and Jenkins, the valet, of 38. So all of these different characters brought something to the offer, but the visitor got to interact with them as they went round, so got to understand their stories and began to build on the different things that applied to them through the house. So I've run through that one, sorry. So looking at the current audiences, so No.1 had a good idea of who their current audiences were, especially coming in to the house pre-pandemic, and they included the sort of cultural and heritage day trippers to Bath. So the target audiences that they wanted to move to was really looking at younger adults with disposable incomes, individuals and families that have more of a diverse background, local residents, how they can expend that to within an hour of visit, and also those audiences with more diverse interests. So bringing that all together. We looked at a throughput, so because it's a linear route through the house, we had design day capacity of 549 people. We worked out we could start people at 10-minute intervals at 6 people per house, and therefore we had about 80 people going through at once that would work through the pandemic, but could then be expanded on as we began to come out of lockdown. We suggested that potentially there might be some need for marshalling, but we had to work out how that would work with people moving through the rooms. This is the kind of thing we were looking at. So each room had a time. Each of the rooms had like an audio play that played with some surprise audios that came in. Everything had to be timed to the second and programmed for the AV. So as you walked from one room to the next room, it started, but you didn't then cross over and interrupt somebody else's tour. Plus, the house was dreadful for sound spill. So we had to work out what could play that wasn't going to interrupt with something else playing. Hence, this table of the tour times was arrived at and tested several times on site. We then had the visitor route, so we were looking at every room being mapped and then the principal rooms actually having something in them. So the first room you go into is on the left-hand side of the slide, the dining room, and that's where you meet the family. So the family are there, you meet them in the morning, what you can do is you're introduced to this idea of the family had a day set out for them and they would move through. So as you went, you moved through into the parlour where Amelia, the mother, then discusses the day ahead with Mrs. Knott, her housekeeper. The gentleman's retreat, the next room on, where Thomas, the father, and his son Richard are discussing business and looking at their businesses in Hampshire and interests in Jamaica. And it was all done through hidden speakers. You then ascend the stairs and you go into the ladies' chamber, and there it's beginning to get later on. So you begin to meet the family, and it's about 4 o'clock. You meet Alice, Charlotte, and Amelia, who are dressing for dinner, and then they go to the withdrawing room where Alice and Charlotte begin to discuss the season ahead and what they might get from it. You then ascend up into the next one, which is into the gentleman's chamber, and you begin to see this kind of the life of Thomas and his son Richard gambling. They were drinking, the money they were getting from sugar, tobacco, the faith in that as being something that was going to keep them going, before you descend from there, all appearing on different ones. You then go down the back servants' stairs all the way to the bottom, and you begin to hear that story, which is a cooking demonstration in the kitchen where Mrs. Andrew cooks in front of you, the scullery maid discussing the day, Barnes, the lady's maid, Joe, the footman, discussing what they might have seen in Bath, and it finishes in the housekeeper's room with Mrs. Andrews and Joe looking at the changes that have happened. So here are some pictures. So this was all done in COVID, so everything was done in lockdown. So we had to bring everyone together. These are pictures of New Angle working in a controlled environment, in both No.1, you can see in the top left, and then a film set at the bottom in London, where we had all the actors and went through all the shows with them. Installation, this is a picture of some of the installation. So we had to make sure that everything discreetly worked in the house. We were projecting onto the walls, we were making mirrors come to life. Everything had to be linked and everything had to be wired in. So you'll see there's 4,500 meters of cabling was inserted into the house over a 2.5 week period. All had to be improved in terms of the conservation control of the house. And we were so worried because the house is one of a kind, and we had to make sure that it all happened first time exactly right and no damage to the house at all. Is this R1? So the result, 5 months turnaround as it turned out, which was increased from 40 Zoom meetings, all filming days, screens inserted, hidden speakers put in. We had new housings built that sat within the historic items, scenic frames put in. It had to be fully accessible, so hearing loops in every space. We had a rack control room that could then be pre-programmed with new shows. Orientation panels printed and fitted, and listed building consent had to be turned around in a 12-week period. And then all installed, tested and ready for opening in 3.5 weeks.
So as you can imagine, we were quite knackered by the end of it. What I should also say is we had a curatorial team of 2. So we packed up the entire house in 4 days, and then redressed the entire house in 5. So it was interesting, but also proved to us that we could do it. And as Jamie said, we created a family, but from the very beginning, I was very insistent that if we were creating a fictional family, every single thing that they did was entirely based on really rigorous research and fact. So every dress shop they mention, the times of walking on Crescent Field, other people living in the city that they mention are all fact. So that gives us that layer of authenticity because we were creating a fictional family within which to tell, or through which to tell the story. So we have video talking mirrors in the dining room. We have my absolute favourite bit of the entire thing, which is in the gentleman's bedroom, father and son in conversation, and the fabrication of the pieces. So this is entirely new fabricated objects that look very, very good and really high quality. And then in the drawing room, we project onto the main wall. And we did a lot of time looking at light levels, looking at the impact that this would have, the conservation implications that this would have. And ironically, the light levels projecting onto the wall are lower than they were when the entire room was normally open and all the shutters were open. So that was quite a learning experience. And then a top-down projection in the kitchen where you see Dr. Annie Gray's hands making desserts. The Jane Austen tour was, I'm going to be very frank, cheaper to do, but no less effective. We went for 2 actors speaking to camera. It was written in-house, so it didn't involve a scriptwriter. Written in-house and is really, really good. I mean, it's all really good, but the Jane Austen tour is really good. And then the Christmas experience, where we again wrote in-house the content, and the house is redressed. And this is the only one that the house is actually redressed for. We can go between the other 2 without changing anything. So our immediate evaluation, going along the lines of Evaluate the Hell, in the summer of 2021 was really interesting. We had absolutely, as we expected, people who loved it and people who hated it. While some of those negative reviews reflected a dislike of the new experience, most of them related to the missing narrative about the rooms and collections. And this was the thing that I was very aware of and knew that we were missing, which was actually the information about the collections and the rooms themselves. And what they didn't complain about was the lack of room guides. The good thing about pre-booking was it meant we could email a survey to every single person that had pre-booked. So pre-COVID, we were probably getting about 26 surveys a month, and we're now getting about 150. So it gives us much more robust data when we're doing our evaluation and when we're looking at our responses. And obviously, this year will be our first complete year. So this year will give us a really good benchmark data to go from. And we were also monitoring feedback through emails and looking at what people were responding to. So it is not for everyone, and we knew that. But what it's done is created spaces that are atmospheric, that feel lived in, that are not static. So it has been absolutely transformative for our historic house. And knowing that it's not for everyone and knowing that we knew that there were going to be people that wouldn't like it, I would really, really urge people to be brave and providing something that you think everyone is going to like, which actually we had done for quite a long time, can be quite kind of mediocre in responses. So we were really sort of excited about it and the learning that we're getting from it, which is informing our next steps. But we knew that there was stuff missing. So we knew that we were only offering a certain interpretation. What we have since done, working again with PLB, is we have introduced an app throughout the house, QR-coded app, and that app actually delivers historic content about the room, collection highlights about what's in the room, and since that's been live, those visitor responses are just going up and up and up as well in terms of our responses. So we're a sort of 4.5, 4.8 on TripAdvisor. And that's just providing the next layer of interpretation to the house. And because we really recognise that there are a lot of visitors that for whom that is still really important, as it is for particularly us as curators. But what I will say is what the visitor feedback was really clear about is that it is not the room guides that are being missed, it's the lack of information about the rooms and the collections in them. And I think that's something that's really important to get across. And that QR code is up and running, but what it also gives us is the flexibility to add different tours. So we have the QR code for the main tour, we have a children's tour, and both with the AV system and the soundscapes and the QR code, we are now looking at what are our next layers of information. Using that visitor feedback, what tours would people like? Specifically about painting, more about trade and colonialism, more about the lives of women in Georgian Bath. So we're using that feedback to start thinking about the next ones that we make. But we also know what they cost. And that means we can budget for it, it means we can plan for it, and we can look at having those changes that you make every year to your interpretation, those changes that you make every 3 years, and those that you make every 5 years, so that we're business planning and we're budgeting accordingly. So that this is what we have for the current 3 to 4 years. But it will change and it will evolve as our research changes, as our collections development changes. So our desire in this project was to invest in that infrastructure and equipment to which new content can be continually added and adapted. And we've achieved this whilst funds are going to be required to do more. And under construction as we speak, actually, the thing that a lot of the visitor feedback came back with was people wanted to know what happened next. So did Charlotte marry? Did Richard gamble away the entire fortune? How Bridgerton did it really get? And at the moment, we're working on an interactive with PLB again, where actually you can choose the future of the characters and you can see what happens to them. And these, other layers will be our priority over the next coming years. Before I finish, what I should say is that we couldn't have achieved any of this if it hadn't been for the National Lottery Heritage Fund Emergency Fund grants and the Cultural Recovery grants. And we were very bold in those grant applications. So we went in not just to survive, but to invest in being viable post-pandemic, so that we could really look to that new future. So thank you very much to those grants. We also had an incredible trustee team who were equally as brave and trusted us and said, this is a risk, but go for it. And that was extraordinary to have that support from our trustees, where they knew it would be a risk, they knew some people wouldn't like it, but we had to do something and we had to look at change. So what I would say is that the project has made us braver, it's made us bolder, it's made us more willing to take risks, but it's also okay to get it wrong. It's also okay to know that some things might not work. And we know that some things didn't work. The timing, that amazing spreadsheet of timing that Jamie spent hours and hours at 2 o'clock in the morning putting together, we then ended up having to walk through and go, oh, that one just needs to be 30 seconds quicker, and that one. And the minute restrictions relaxed and more people started coming and looking for that more free flow experience through a house rather than the timed control, we're now seeing where we have to adjust those timings. But everything's run from an iPad. Will Riches, who are here today, can come in through the back door and change it without coming to site. So it's been a really interesting kind of testing process. But we gave ourselves and our trustees gave us permission to fail. And I think that was really, really important because it means we know that the next one we do, we'll do this a bit differently. We'll try this a bit differently. We'll be a bit braver on something else. And it's also okay if not everybody likes it. I think historic house interpretation has a very ingrained tradition. The fact that we were doing this in 5 months actually meant we couldn't second guess our decisions. We couldn't question absolutely everything. A lot of the time we just had to say, yeah, let's go for it. And it's been really, really exciting. It's been really rewarding. It's been a hell of a learning curve. But it's also given us a real thirst for change across our other museums. And I think that's really, really important. So now we are looking at major projects in all 3 of our museums, because it's given us the confidence to actually think about doing something a bit different. So I strongly urge people to be brave, and also to kind of think of these things. Historic houses, particularly somewhere like Bath, is often seen as that classic frozen in aspic, and they are not, as we know. They are growing, changing, evolving places, and we need to keep that kind of dynamism within the house, so that it isn't static. And that's probably one of the biggest things that we've seen that's changed. And visitors like it. So I think, any question? We've got time for questions? Any questions? That's it.
That's it, thank you. Did anyone have a quick question just while we're...
Is that on? That is on.
Hi, thanks so much. I just had a couple of questions. Just first of all about security.
Yes.
Obviously, you talked about CCTV. Is that everywhere? Did people pick things up and touch them?
So amazingly, we didn't have CCTV in the house at all. So we introduced CCTV at first through the emergency fund. And then even more of it through the cultural recovery. We also introduced alarmed barriers, picture alarms, object alarms. The dining room, for example, is quite barrierless, so you can walk around the table, but we introduced pressure-sensitive tabletops, which was my most exciting part of the project. As all curators will know, you pick up a spoon and an alarm goes off. And actually what I will say is that didn't cost a lot of money either. And we obviously went through all of those layers of security with our lenders, with the National Security Advisor, so that we could update it for the fact that there wasn't a physical person in every room. I mean, we still have a person on each floor, so that when the alarm goes, they can get into that room within 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And so far, the most times you hear an alarm going is because someone's brushed against the tablecloth, and the tablecloth moving has set the alarm off. And that's how sensitive the tabletop alarms are. So yeah, we did quite a lot of work on security when we were preparing it.
Thank you. And just very quickly, can I just ask, did you hit your targeted audience and did you lose your old audience?
Interesting. So we saw, and that was kind of partly pandemic outcome as well, we saw a lot more local visitors. We saw a lot more family visitors. We saw a lot more young people. But that's the gift that keeps on giving, that is Bridgerton as well. And we did see, we're starting to see a more diverse audience. And I should say that from the very beginning, that thing of the visitor emailing us and saying a volunteer told them that Bath had no connection to the transatlantic slave trade. From the very beginning, we were committed to embedding that storyline in the heart of the central story. So the income being generated through transatlantic slavery coming in through Bristol, and the products and profits of it through the house, and that was something that was really core. And we are seeing slowly an increase in diverse visitors. We did lose some core visitors, largely our who were also ex-volunteers and members. But we also did a lot of that kind of like following people around the house and seeing like unobtrusive, like trying to see what they were saying. And you get, a couple coming in who are, and apologies to, but classic National Trust visitors. And you thought, oh, they're not going to like this. They're not going to like the drawing room. They're not going to like the projections. And then overhearing them in the gentleman's bedroom and saying, this is amazing, isn't it? This is just really interesting. So I think we've actually been quite surprised at the response from the traditional country, like historic house visitor. And there are some people that are never going to like it. But you know, we're also seeing a much, much younger audience. And I'm being really brutal here, and if our director of museums were here, she'd be like, Amy, you know, we're a historic house in Bath. There is a certain audience that all we need to do is open the door and they will come. You know, the historic house visitor, the Georgian house visitor of a certain age and ethnicity and income, they're going to come whatever we do. So I'm sort of a bit less interested in them. I mean, we're always going to be interested in them, but I'm much, much more interested in 16 to 24-year-olds. And you know, we've mentioned Bridgerton a lot, but I mean, we're one of the houses in the show, so, it is getting in popular culture, and that's also what kind of the idea of creating a family rather than basing it on a historic resident is if it gets young people interested in the Georgian period, if it gets them that bit of curiosity about the 18th century or the long 18th century, that's brilliant. Because that will then develop into visits, into more interests, so I think that's really important, that idea of you know, popular culture and the way we tell our stories. And the fact and the history is there, it absolutely underpins everything we do. But the way we tell it, we can be flexible with and we can change. Sorry, that's a really long answer to your question.
Any more questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, I wanted to know if you, A, stuck to your budget, and B, did you hit your visitor target? I noticed you had 60,000. Was that an annual?
60,000, 65,000 was pre-pandemic. So we, yes, we stuck to the budget. I mean, mainly because we managed to get a little bit more from another part of the grant. Because actually trying to do something like this, I mean, that's what I will say, trying to do something like this on 300,000 when you've got put in 4,500 meters of cabling in a Grade 1 listed house is interesting. But yeah, we stuck to the budget, delivered it, you know, on time. And we did actually surprisingly well for 2021. But we had also business planned for this year to still be 6 people every 10 minutes. So we're actually doing better than we predicted for this year because we're letting in more people, but we're still controlling numbers actually because there's a lot of visitor confidence in feeling safe still as you go around the house, particularly a house with small rooms. So we're doing better than we predicted for this year at the moment. We're obviously nowhere near 2019. But we've also business planned for actually a dip in the summer because UK tourists are going to go abroad and we are not getting international tourists back. So we're not expecting to kind of really hit 2019 numbers until 2023 or 2024. But it's been surprising how many people have come back, actually. Yeah.
I think the other thing is we had to work the budgets really hard.
Yeah.
Because it seems like a lot of money, but across the whole of the house.
Yeah.
And we had about £40,000 worth of infrastructure that needed to be put into the house as well, which just stole a huge chunk as we start. So we're going, yeah, we've got lots, we'll do, oh, where's that gone?
And I think, you know, the quality of what was produced says it's worth paying for the quality of what was produced, the filming, but it also showed us what we can do in-house. You know, we have the knowledge, but you can do the kind of slightly more budget version, but you know it pays to. The production qualities are just fantastic.
We've got one more time for, one more question. Yeah, time for one more question. Someone that...
We'll have to make this a quick one.
Okay.
Hi, I'm just curious on how your customers or your visitors then interact with you. If everything's immersive and it's being told to them, that reduces the opportunity for questions and sort of engagement.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Our museum administrators, who are our kind of front of house team, so we have one person on the door, one person through the house, and one person on the kind of shop. So we actually run it on quite a small structure. They do an introduction at the beginning, but that's really the only kind of person that they get. What they're seeing now that restrictions are less, now that people are more comfortable to sit in a room and watch something twice or do the app between the shows playing, is some people are actually coming back to the front desk or the person that rotates being asked questions. And what we're developing now for next year is 6 to 8 minute speedy talks. So we will once an hour do a room an hour, and that between the 10-minute crossover of the soundscapes, one of the museum assistants will actually do a 6-minute talk about an object or a feature in the room. So we're developing those at the moment, and we'll test them, and we'll see if that actually works, or does it make it sort of too busy. And that's something that I was really worried about sort of that really in-depth layer of information. So we haven't cracked it yet, but we're going to test a few different things to try and see what we can do, and then at the same time add another layer to the app as well. So it's it's very hard to kind of part with the person. Because we all know one of the best ways of delivering, there's nothing better than an enthusiastic, passionate person talking to you about something. But we sort of started from a point of the control we wanted over the stories, and then build up how we add those new layers. I mean, it might work. It could just, like, that sound clash could just, like, not work at all if someone with a really loud voice is talking about Alexander Pope in one room, while in the room next door they're talking about the profits in the tea houses from transatlantic slavery. So it might not work, but we're going to test it and see.
Thank you so much to Jamie and Amy again. One more round of applause.
Well done.